James Collins stood frozen at the edge of his backyard, his mind struggling to process the sight before him. His beautiful pool, the one he had saved up for years to build, was now nothing more than a solid slab of drying cement. The clear blue water, the floating lounge chairs, the built-in lights that sparkled at night, it was all gone, ruined. His hands clenched in a fist as his gaze locked onto the culprit standing smugly beside the disaster. Karen Wilkinson, the self-appointed ruler of the Maplewood Estates Homeowners Association, stood with her arms crossed, her sharp face twisted in satisfaction. "I warned you, James," she said, her voice dripping with arrogance. "You were in violation of HOA regulations, and I took appropriate action." James's heart pounded in his chest, a storm of anger and disbelief raging inside him. "You fill my pool with cement. Are you out of your mind?" Karen simply smirked, her chin lifting defiantly. "I don't make the rules. I just enforce them." James took a deep breath, his nostrils flaring as he tried to steady himself. He wanted to scream, to throw something, to demand an explanation that made even an ounce of sense. But then, the sound of sirens cut through the air. Karen's smug expression faltered as 3 police cars pulled up in front of James's house. Officers stepped out, their faces serious. "Is there a problem here?" one of them asked. James pointed directly at Karen. "She destroyed my property. That's my pool under all that cement." Karen scoffed. "It's an HOA matter." He was in violation. "The board." The officer raised a hand, cutting her off. "Ma'am, do you understand that destruction of private property on this scale is a felony?" Karen's face drained of color. "A what?" The officer's eyes hardened. "You may have just committed a serious crime." Karen took a step back, shaking her head. No. That can't be right. I was just..." But before she could finish her sentence, the officer reached for his handcuffs. And that was when the screaming began. Just 3 weeks earlier, James had never even imagined himself in this situation. His life had been peaceful, normal. He had moved into Maplewood Estates 5 years ago, looking for a fresh start. It was a nice neighborhood, big houses, green lawns, friendly families. But there was one problem: the HOA. Or rather, Karen Wilkinson. She wasn't just a member of the HOA. She was the HOA. Every meeting, every rule, every ridiculous fine, she controlled it all. And she took her power very seriously. At first, James tried to stay out of her way. He paid his dues, kept his lawn trimmed, followed the rules. But no matter what he did, Karen always found a reason to target him. A small crack in his driveway, he got a warning letter. His trash cans were an inch too close to the sidewalk. Another warning. When he left his Christmas lights up a single day past the deadline, he received a fine in the mail. It was clear that Karen had made him her personal project. Still, James did his best to ignore her. Until the pool. James had always dreamed of having a pool. A place to relax, to enjoy summer, to cool off after a long day. But Maplewood Estates had strict rules about pools. They had to be a certain size, a certain color, a certain shape. And of course, Karen was in charge of approving every single application. James had submitted his request twice, and both times, Karen had rejected it for ridiculous reasons. The shade of blue is too bright. The tile design doesn't match the neighborhood aesthetic. The depth is slightly deeper than the recommended HOA standard. James knew the truth. Karen didn't want him to have a pool. She wanted control. So, after months of fighting, he did something drastic. He bypassed the HOA completely. Instead of going through Karen, he went to the county permit office and got approval directly from the city. It was perfectly legal. HOA rules didn't override city permits, and the law was on his side. By the time Karen found out, it was too late. The pool was already built, and she was furious. She showed up at his house, demanding he remove the pool. James refused. She threatened fines. He ignored them. She sent letters. He tossed them in the trash. That's when the real war began. Karen started harassing him. One night, she called in a noise complaint when James wasn't even home. Another time, she had someone dump a pile of dead leaves in his yard, then sent him a violation letter for poor lawn maintenance. But James refused to back down. The pool stayed. And that's when Karen snapped. James had no idea how she had done it. No idea who had helped her. But somehow, In the middle of the night, Karen had managed to get an entire truckload of cement poured straight into his pool. By the time he woke up, the damage was already done. James had never felt rage like this before. But now, as he watched Karen's face go pale while the officer reached for his handcuffs, he felt something else. Satisfaction. Karen had spent years abusing her power, treating the neighborhood like her personal kingdom. Now, she was finally about to face real consequences. But just as the officer grabbed Karen's wrist, a voice called out, "Wait, stop." James turned his head, his stomach sinking. Standing at the edge of the street was Paul Denton, the HOA's vice president. And he didn't look the least bit surprised by what was happening. In fact, he looked like he had been expecting this. And that was when James realized Karen hadn't done this alone. She had help, and the fight wasn't over yet. James's stomach tightened as Paul Denton stepped forward, his expression eerily calm despite the chaos unfolding in front of him. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cars reflected off his round glasses, and for a moment, James could swear he saw the faintest trace of a smirk. Karen, who just seconds ago was white as a ghost, suddenly looked emboldened, as if Paul's presence had given her some kind of lifeline. The officer, still gripping his cuffs, narrowed his eyes. "And you are?" Paul adjusted his tie, his voice smooth as silk. "Paul Denton, vice president of the Maplewood Estates HOA." The officer didn't look impressed. "And," Paul clasped his hands together, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding. This is an HOA enforcement action. The pool was non-compliant with neighborhood regulations, and, per our bylaws, the HOA has the authority to remove or rectify violations." James felt his blood boil. Rectify? That wasn't rectification. That was destruction. He stepped forward, his voice sharp. "You people think you could just break into my property and destroy what you don't like? That's not how the law works." Paul didn't even glance at James. He simply nodded toward the officer. "With all due respect, officer, this is a civil matter, not a criminal one." The officer's expression darkened. "You filled a man's pool with cement." Paul's smirk barely faltered. The HOA acted within its rights. Before the officer could respond, a new voice cut through the night. "That's not true." James turned toward his driveway, and there stood Lena Martinez, his lawyer. James exhaled, relief washing over him. He had called Lena the moment he saw the pool, and now she had arrived just in time. She walked up, heels clicking against the pavement, her eyes locking onto Paul's with steely determination. "The HOA doesn't have the legal authority to destroy private property. Your rules don't override state law." Before we continue, please click the subscribe button for more amazing stories like this. Thank you. Now back to the story. Paul's smirk finally vanished. Lena didn't let him finish. "Not only is this destruction of property, but the value of damage done exceeds the felony threshold for this state." She turned to the officer. "Which means Lena pointed directly at Karen, "just committed a crime." Karen stammered. But I was just." Paul stepped in front of her. "There's no proof that Karen was the one who ordered the cement." James clenched his jaw. "Are you joking? She's standing right here, bragging about it." Lena smirked, pulling out her phone. "Actually, we do have proof." She tapped the screen and turned the volume up. Karen's voice came through, crystal clear. "I warned you, James. You were in violation of HOA regulations, and I took appropriate action." Karen gasped. You recorded me?" Lena raised an eyebrow. "You don't sound so smug now." The officer didn't hesitate this time. He snapped the cuffs onto Karen's wrists. "You're under arrest for destruction of property." Karen shrieked, thrashing in the officer's grip. "No, you can't do this. I'm HOA. I am the HOA." James couldn't help it. He laughed. The woman who had tormented him for years, the woman who had tried to ruin his life, was now getting dragged to a squad car, screaming like a child throwing a tantrum. But James wasn't stupid. Paul hadn't flinched, and that worried him. As Karen was forced into the car, Paul simply adjusted his tie and turned to James with an almost bored expression. "This isn't over," he said. James crossed his arms. "Oh, I think it is." Paul smiled, a cold, knowing smile. "No, James, you just started something much bigger than you realize." Then, Without another word, he turned and walked away. James felt the hair on his arms rise. Paul wasn't just another HOA member. He was something worse. And deep down, James knew this war was far from over. 2 days later, James woke up to a thick envelope stuffed into his mailbox. It was from the HOA. Inside were 3 separate lawsuits. One for defamation against Karen, one for unauthorized construction, and one for breach of HOA contract. James's heart pounded as he flipped through the paperwork. This wasn't a fight anymore. This was an all-out war, and the HOA had just fired the next shot. James sat at his kitchen table, staring at the thick envelope in front of him. His coffee sat untouched, growing cold as he flipped through page after page of legal nonsense. 3 lawsuits, 3 separate attacks, all coming from the HOA. A part of him wanted to believe this was just a desperate move, Karen's last attempt to retaliate from behind bars. But he knew better. This wasn't just Karen anymore. This was Paul Denton, and he was the real threat. James exhaled sharply and grabbed his phone. He hit the speed dial, and within 2 rings, Lena answered. I just got sued. 3 times. Lena didn't sound the least bit surprised. I figured they'd try something. What's the damage? James skimmed the papers again, frustration burning in his chest. 1 for defamation, 1 for unauthorized construction, and 1 for breach of HOA contract. Lena clicked her tongue. Typical. They're throwing everything at the wall, hoping something sticks. James rubbed his temples. Can they win? The defamation case is nonsense, Lena said. Karen was arrested in broad daylight. There's nothing defamatory about repeating the truth. James felt a bit of relief until Lena continued. The unauthorized construction charge is trickier. You have the county's approval, which is legally stronger than the HOA's rejection. But if they argue a technicality in the contract, she sighed, that could drag out. James scowled. And the contract breach? Lena hesitated. That made James nervous. James, she said slowly, I need you to be honest with me. Did you sign the HOA agreement when you moved in? James frowned. Yeah, but that was 5 years ago. I didn't read every single line. Lena groaned. You should have. If there's a clause about arbitration, they could force this into an HOA-controlled legal process. James slammed his fist on the table. You're telling me they could be judge, jury, and executioner in their own lawsuit? Depends on the wording, Lena admitted. Send me the contract. I'll comb through it. James exhaled and ran a hand through his hair. What do I do in the meantime? Lena's voice was firm. Don't talk to Paul. Don't talk to any HOA members. From now on, everything goes through me. James nodded, gripping the phone tighter. Got it. But deep down, he knew one thing for sure. Paul wasn't going to play fair. That night, James double-checked that every door and window was locked. He didn't trust these people. Not after what they had done to his pool. Not after the lawsuits. And certainly not after the way Paul had smirked at him when Karen got arrested. James was exhausted, but sleep didn't come easy. His mind kept replaying every conversation, every moment, every way this could go wrong. At some point, his exhaustion finally won, and he drifted off. Then, bang, James jolted awake. Another bang, then glass shattering. His heart pounded as he leaped out of bed, adrenaline rushing through his veins. He grabbed his phone and sprinted toward the noise. The backyard. He flipped on the floodlights, and his blood ran cold. His fence was wide open, and standing in the middle of his cement-filled pool were 2 figures, dressed in black hoodies and ski masks. One of them held a crowbar. The other? A gasoline canister. James barely had time to react before the first figure snapped their head toward him. Then, without warning, they ran straight at him. James barely had time to think before the masked figure lunged at him, crowbar raised. Instinct took over. He ducked just in time as the heavy metal swung over his head, narrowly missing his face. The force of the missed hit sent the attacker off balance for a split second, but that was all James needed. He shoved the masked figure backward with everything he had, sending them stumbling over the uneven cement-filled pool. The second intruder, the one with the gasoline canister, dropped it in panic and bolted toward the fence. James turned his attention back to the first attacker, who had barely regained his footing. Who the hell sent you? James growled. No response. But before James could do anything else, the attacker spun on his heel and took off running. James's eyes darted to the discarded gasoline canister lying by the pool. His stomach twisted. They were going to burn my house down. A fresh wave of rage surged through him. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was attempted arson. And James knew exactly who was behind it. Paul Denton. James snatched his phone from his pocket and dialed 911, his breathing still heavy from the adrenaline. I need the police. Now. The cops arrived within minutes, but by then, the masked intruders were long gone. James stood by his ruined pool, arms crossed tightly over his chest as he explained everything to the officers. I turned on the lights and saw two guys. One had a crowbar, the other had a gasoline canister. He gestured toward the canister, still lying where they dropped it. They ran the moment I saw them. One of the officers, a middle-aged man with a hardened expression, knelt down and inspected the canister. He sniffed the air. It's definitely gas. James clenched his jaw. They were going to burn my house down. The officer nodded grimly. You got security cameras? James exhaled sharply. Not in the backyard. I never thought I'd need them. The officer frowned. That's a problem. Without footage, identifying them is going to be tough. James's frustration boiled over. It's the HOA. Paul Denton is behind this. They're pissed because I got Karen arrested, and now they're trying to scare me off. The officers exchanged a look. James knew that look. They weren't convinced. We can't make assumptions, the second officer said, pulling out his notepad. But we'll file a report. If there are any more incidents, call us immediately. James wanted to scream. This wasn't just an incident. This was an escalation. But he could tell the police weren't going to do much, not unless he had hard proof. James took a deep breath, forcing himself to think. If the cops wouldn't help him, he'd have to handle this himself. The next morning, James drove straight to an electronics store and dropped over $1,000 on top-of-the-line security cameras. Motion detection, night vision, live streaming. If those HOA lunatics tried anything again, he'd catch everything. By the afternoon, he had cameras covering every angle of his property. The front yard, the backyard, the driveway, even a hidden one facing the street. Now, if someone so much as stepped on his property, he'd know instantly. And if Paul was behind this, he was going down. That night, James sat on his couch, watching the security feed on his phone. Every few minutes, he checked each camera, half expecting to see someone lurking. But everything was quiet. Still, he didn't trust it. He stayed awake until 3 a.m., watching, waiting. Then, a motion alert popped up. James's heart stopped. He tapped the notification, pulling up the live feed. Front yard. His pulse raced as the screen loaded. And then his stomach dropped. Standing at the edge of his driveway, just outside the camera's range, was Paul Denton. Just standing there, watching. James's grip on his phone tightened. His whole body felt cold. Paul knew about the cameras. That's why he was staying just out of range. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. James sat frozen, his eyes locked on the screen. Paul Denton was just standing there, not moving, not saying anything, just watching. James's hand hovered over his phone screen. He could call the police again. But what would he even say? Help. The HOA guys standing outside my house. They'd laugh. And Paul knew it. James clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around his phone. If Paul was trying to rattle him, it was working. But James refused to give him the satisfaction. He took a deep breath. Then, without breaking eye contact with the security feed, he reached toward his garage opener. A second later, the garage door lurched upward. Paul didn't move. James stepped outside, his bare feet cool against the concrete driveway. The street was eerily silent. The only sound was the faint buzzing of streetlights overhead. Paul was still there, standing just on the other side of James's property line. James crossed his arms. You lost something? Paul smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile, more like a warning. Just getting some fresh air, Paul said, tilting his head. Didn't realize you were so paranoid. James forced himself to stay calm. What do you want, Paul? Paul didn't answer right away. Instead, he casually slipped his hands into his pockets and took a slow step forward, just enough that the tips of his shoes touched James's driveway. A deliberate move. He was testing boundaries. James held his ground. Paul chuckled. You're making a mistake, you know. James exhaled sharply. Yeah, filling my pool with cement wasn't a mistake. Paul shrugged. Karen got a little excessive. His voice was too calm, too smooth. But I wasn't talking about the pool. James's stomach tightened. I meant the lawsuits, Paul continued. The HOA always wins, James. Always. James gritted his teeth. You people are insane. Paul smiled again. No, we're organized. James's fingers curled into fists. You think you can scare me? Burn my house down? Send people after me in the middle of the night? Paul's expression didn't change, but he didn't deny it. James took a slow step forward. I don't scare easy, Paul. Paul's smile didn't waver. We'll see. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. James stood there, heart pounding, watching as Paul disappeared into the darkness. This wasn't a warning. It was a promise. The next morning, James met with Lena at her office. I wanted to countersue, he said the moment he sat down. Lena blinked. James, I haven't even finished reviewing the HOA contract yet. I don't care, James said firmly. They're not just trying to sue me. They're trying to scare me. And last night, Paul Ditton showed up outside my house at 3 a.m. Lena's eyes narrowed. Did he threaten you? James hesitated. Not outright, but he made it clear they're not backing down. Lena exhaled, tapping her pen against her desk. Okay, let's talk strategy. She reached into a folder and pulled out a thick stack of printed pages. James frowned. What's that? Lena slid the papers toward him. The Maplewood Estates HOA contract. James's stomach twisted. You signed this, Lena continued, flipping to a specific page. And right here, it says that any legal disputes must go through HOA arbitration before a lawsuit can be filed. James frowned. So what does that mean? Lena tapped the page. It means they can sue you for breach of contract, but you can't sue them until you go through their arbitration process first. James's hands tightened around the chair arms. So they get to make the rules? Lena nodded. That's how these HOA agreements work. They're designed to trap homeowners. James leaned back, frustration boiling over. So what do we do? Lena smirked. Oh, don't worry, she said. They want a legal fight? We'll give them one. That night, James sat on his couch, refreshing his security feed every few minutes. It had been 24 hours since Paul's little visit. No movement, no masked figures, no gasoline canisters. But James wasn't stupid. Something was coming, and he was right. Because at exactly 2:42 a.m., his phone vibrated with a motion alert. James's breath hitched as he pulled up the feed. His backyard. A shadowy figure stood near the side fence. But this time, they weren't running. They were digging. James's blood ran cold. What the hell are they burying in my yard? Before he could think, before he could grab his phone, before he could even react, the figure suddenly turned and stared straight into the camera. They knew they were being watched. They wanted James to see. Then, slowly, deliberately, the figure raised a single finger to their lips. A silent warning. Then, just as quickly as they appeared, they vanished into the night. And James knew. This was only the beginning. James's pulse raced as he stared at the security footage. The figure in his backyard, with the silent warning and the way they disappeared into the shadows. It was like they wanted him to know something. He replayed the footage over and over again, trying to piece together anything that might give him a clue. Who was it? What are they burying? And why do they look so calm? He grabbed his phone and dialed Lena. The call rang through. James, what's up? Lena answered, sounding groggy. You need to get over here now, James said, urgency in his voice. I've got something on the cameras. They're here again, digging in my backyard. Lena's tone shifted instantly. Are you sure? I saw it with my own eyes. They were digging, burying something. Then they looked straight into the camera and gave me a silent warning. James shook his head in disbelief. What do they want from me? What the hell is going on? Lena was quiet for a moment. Stay inside. I'll be there in 20 minutes. James hung up and went straight to his backyard. He grabbed a flashlight and scanned the area where the figure had been. His mind raced. Was it Paul? Or had they sent someone else to send a message? The night air felt heavier now, more suffocating. He stood by the spot where the figure had been, looking for any signs of digging. But there was nothing. No holes. No disturbed earth. It was as though the ground had never been touched. But that didn't make sense. The footage was clear. James rubbed his temples. Maybe he was imagining things. He'd been under so much stress lately. Maybe the tension was playing tricks on him. But just as he was about to turn back toward the house, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Lena. "Call the police. There's something you need to know." His heart skipped a beat. What could be so important? Why didn't she just tell him over the phone? He dialed her number immediately, his hands trembling. Lena picked up almost immediately. "James, there's something I found." "What do you mean?" "Remember that defamation lawsuit they're trying to throw at you?" Lena's voice was tight, like she was holding back something big. "I got a call from someone inside the HOA." James felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean, someone inside?" Lena's voice dropped. "Someone who used to work with Paul Denton. They're telling me there's more going on than just the pool, James." James felt his heart rate pick up. "What's going on? Weren't you telling me?" Lena exhaled sharply. "Paul Denton isn't just the vice president of the HOA. He's been laundering money through neighborhood fines. He's been using the HOA's rules to extort homeowners." James's mind reeled. "Money laundering?" "Yeah, and it gets worse." Lena paused. "I found out they've been selling information to a construction company. That's why Karen wanted you out of the pool. It wasn't just about the rules. It was about money. The pool design didn't meet their guidelines, but that didn't matter. They were trying to push you out so they could sell the land for a development project." James's breath caught in his throat. They were using the HOA as a cover to steal from the homeowners? And you think Paul is the one behind all of it? Lena didn't answer right away. "Yes, but here's the thing. They're not done yet." James's brain was spinning. "What do you mean by that? What are they going to do now?" Lena's voice went quiet. "James, they might try to bury the evidence. If Paul thinks you're a threat, he won't hesitate to get rid of you. Physically, if necessary." The words hit James like a sledgehammer. He had always known that Paul Denton was ruthless, but he never imagined it would escalate to this level. "Where are you?" Lena asked. "I'm still in my place." "What?" "Stay inside. Don't go outside again until I get there. I think they may have already put something in the ground in your backyard." James's eyes flicked toward the backyard again. Could that be what the figure was burying? The evidence? A sense of dread pooled in his stomach. "I'm not letting them win, Lena," James said, his voice suddenly hard. "I'm going to take them down. I'll be ready when you get here." "Good," Lena replied, her tone steady but full of resolve. "We're going to need everything we've got to stop them." James disconnected the call, taking a deep breath. He couldn't shake the feeling that something more was going to happen tonight. Something big. Then, his phone buzzed again. It was a message from an unknown number. "You're playing a dangerous game, James. You're not going to win." The words sent a chill straight to his bones. The message was signed with a single letter. P. He felt his blood run cold. Paul. And then, as if the night couldn't get any worse, his security feed flashed again. The motion alert popped up, and this time, there were two figures standing in his front yard. They weren't running. They were waiting. And James realized this was their move. James's heart raced as he stared at the motion alert on his phone. Two figures standing in his front yard, perfectly still. He could barely make out their shapes in the dim light from the street lamps. But one thing was clear. They weren't just passing by. They were waiting for something. His breath caught in his throat. Had they been watching him all this time? Were they waiting for him to make a mistake? Without thinking, James grabbed his phone and quickly texted Lena. "They're here. Two figures in my front yard. I need you now." He wasn't sure if Lena had already seen the footage or if she was on her way, but he didn't have time to wait. His mind was spinning. Could this be a direct threat? Were they going to escalate things further? What were they planning? He stood in the living room, not moving a muscle, staring at the security feed on his phone. The two figures hadn't moved an inch. Then suddenly, a loud knock echoed through his front door. James's heart skipped a beat. His pulse thundered in his ears. He didn't move. Another knock. Harder this time. James's mind raced. What should he do? His first instinct was to call the police, but he already knew that wouldn't work. They'd take too long. And besides, who could he even prove was on his property? No one had yet broken in. This was all happening in the open. The knock came again, sharper and more demanding. James Collins. The voice was unmistakable. It was Paul Denton. James felt a chill settle over him. He knew Paul wasn't going to leave until he got what he wanted. The man was ruthless, manipulative. If Paul was here, it meant he was done playing games. But James wasn't going to back down. Not this time. He grabbed his baseball bat from the hallway closet and crept toward the door. His fingers wrapped tightly around the handle of the bat. The knocking grew louder and more insistent, and he felt the weight of the situation settle in his chest. There was no turning back. James opened the door, just enough to poke his head through the crack. Paul stood there, as calm and collected as ever. His hands were in his pockets, and his face was completely unreadable. "You're on my property, Paul," James said, his voice steady. "I don't want any trouble." Paul smiled, but it was cold, calculating, the smile of someone who had all the power. "Too late for that, James. You've made it personal." James gripped the bat tighter. "Get off my property. Now." Paul didn't flinch. He just stood there, eyes glinting with disdain. "You think you can intimidate me, James? You've made a lot of noise, but you're still just a small player in this game." James's breath caught in his throat. "What game? What are you talking about?" Paul's smile grew wider. "You've seen the digging. You've seen the warning. It's not just about the pool anymore. It's about control. Control over what?" James asked, his heart thumping in his chest. Paul stepped closer, his voice lowering. "Over this entire neighborhood. Over the money we're making off the land. Over the power we hold. The HOA is just the beginning. You've interfered with something much bigger, and now you're going to pay the price." James felt his hands tremble around the bat. "So that's it? You want to own this neighborhood, and you're willing to destroy anyone who gets in your way?" Paul's eyes flashed with something darker. "If I have to, yes. But that's not the real threat, James. The real threat is what happens next." Before James could ask what Paul meant, Paul glanced toward the street. James's gaze followed. There were 3 black SUVs slowly approaching his house. The headlights were off, but their slow, deliberate pace made it clear that they weren't just passing by. They were heading straight for his driveway. James's heart skipped a beat. "Who the hell are they?" he demanded, his grip tightening on the bat. Paul's smile widened. "Those are the people who make things happen. People who don't care about the law. People who don't care about the consequences." The SUVs pulled into James's driveway, and before James could react, the doors opened. 4 men in dark suits stepped out, their expressions hard and cold. They didn't look like anyone from the HOA. These men looked like hitmen. James's stomach twisted. He wasn't in a neighborhood war anymore. He was caught in something far deeper, far more dangerous. Paul chuckled, watching James's reaction. "You've walked into something you can't control, James. Now you have 2 choices. You can walk away and let us finish what we started, or..." He leaned in closer, his voice like ice. "We make sure you never interfere again." James's mind raced. He had to act fast. If those men were really here to intimidate him, or worse, to silence him, he was out of time. He could feel the weight of the bat in his hands, but the odds weren't in his favor. "Get off my property," James said again, his voice a low growl. Paul raised an eyebrow, amused by James's defiance. "You're a stubborn man. I'll give you that." Then, without a second glance, Paul turned and started walking back toward the SUVs. The men in suits followed suit, but one lingered. He turned back to James with a threatening stare. "If you're smart," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "you'll let this go. The last thing you want is to make this harder on yourself." James didn't move as the men piled into the SUVs and drove away, the roar of their engines fading into the distance. But his heart was pounding in his chest, and his mind was racing faster than ever. This was far from over, and the worst part? It was only going to get worse. James stood frozen in the middle of his driveway, bat still in hand, as the SUVs disappeared down the street. His heart was pounding, and his mind was racing. The air felt thick, like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting to fall. What had just happened? He had never imagined the HOA could go this far, could pull people like that into the situation. Paul Denton, the supposed leader of a simple neighborhood homeowners association, wasn't just running an overbearing HOA. He was running a criminal operation, and James was stuck right in the middle of it. James slowly lowered the bat, his grip still tight. His fingers tingled from the tension, but he had to think. Paul Denton wasn't going to back off now. Not after everything that had happened. Not after the lawsuits, the destruction of his pool, and now this threat. James's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he jumped, startled. It was a text from Lena. Get to a safe place. We need to talk. He didn't even hesitate. He knew he had to meet her. He needed to plan what came next. Without wasting any more time, he grabbed his keys and rushed to his car, heart still hammering in his chest. Lena's office was only a short drive away, but it felt like the longest of his life. James's thoughts churned in a whirlpool of fear, anger, and disbelief. The moment he pulled into her parking lot, he saw her standing outside the building, pacing. The second she spotted him, she hurried toward his car. Get out, Lena said urgently as James rolled down his window. He complied, slamming the car door behind him. What's going on, Lena? She grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the entrance of the building. We don't have time to explain everything right now. We need to be quick. They rushed inside and into her office. As soon as the door shut behind them, Lena locked it and motioned for James to sit down. All right, here's what I know, she began, sitting across from him. I got some damning information about Paul Denton and the HOA, but it's going to be risky to use it. Paul has too many connections, people in the right places. James leaned forward, his eyes wide. What do you mean, damning? Lena paused, clearly thinking about how much she could reveal without putting herself in danger. Paul Denton's network isn't just limited to the HOA. He's got ties to real estate developers, construction companies, and even people inside the city council. They've been using the HOA to funnel money from homeowners through overpriced fines and fees, and the bigger the violation, the more money they make. James's stomach twisted. So, they've been using the HOA to launder money, and they were going to sell the neighborhood for some big development project. That's why they targeted me, because my pool didn't fit their plan? Lena nodded. Exactly. And here's the thing. Paul has a lot of people on his side. A lot of them don't care about the law. They're beyond the law. She leaned in, her voice growing quieter. And they're willing to kill to keep their operation going. James felt a cold shiver run down his spine. What? Kill? Are you serious? Lena's eyes met his, and for the first time, James saw the fear in her gaze. Yes, I've been digging into Paul's connections, and I've found out some chilling stuff. There are people on his payroll, real criminals. People who have done worse things than just scare homeowners. James felt his hands go cold. You're telling me that Paul Denton might be behind more than just destroying my pool. He's involved with murder? Lena hesitated. I don't know for sure, but I've found records of missing people. People who were last seen near developments linked to Paul's business deals. This is bigger than just a neighborhood fight, James. And now they know you're onto them. James stood up, pacing in front of her desk. So what do we do now? How do we stop this? Lena pressed her fingers to her temples, clearly overwhelmed. I've been thinking about this for a while. There's a way to take them down, but we'll need evidence. Hard, irrefutable evidence. I'm talking documents, recordings, bank transfers. Something that ties Paul to the money laundering and the murders. But it's going to be dangerous. James stopped pacing and looked at her, his mind racing. What do we need to do? Lena's eyes narrowed. I have a contact who used to work in Paul's circle. They've given me a key piece of information, a ledger with details about the illegal activity. If we can get our hands on it, we can use it to bring everything down. But the ledger is locked away in Paul's private office. James's heart skipped a beat. You want me to break into Paul's office? Lena nodded, her voice steady but firm. Yes, we need that ledger. If we can get it and expose everything, Paul's entire empire will come crashing down. James swallowed hard, tried to steady his nerves. This was getting more dangerous by the second. If Paul found out what they were planning, it could mean the end of everything for both of them. Are you in? Lena asked, her eyes locked onto his. James stared at her for a long moment, the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. He knew this was their only shot. If they didn't act, if they didn't get the evidence, Paul Denton would destroy everything. Let's do it, James said, his voice low. Let's take him down. Lena stood up, a determined look on her face. Then we need to move fast. We don't have much time. The plan was set. The stakes couldn't be higher. James sat in the passenger seat of Lena's car, gripping the edge of the seat as she drove through the quiet streets of Maplewood Estates. It was just after dusk, and the air was thick with the weight of what they were about to do. Paul Denton's office was located in the back of a large commercial building, a place that didn't exactly scream Homeowner Association headquarters. It was isolated, surrounded by overgrown hedges and an intimidating wrought iron gate that had been locked for weeks. But Lena had a contact who knew the back door code, a key to getting past the security systems that protected Paul's secrets. Lena turned to James as she pulled up near the building. "You ready?" James exhaled slowly. He had never done anything like this in his life. His mind kept flashing back to the moment he'd seen the black SUVs outside his house, the threat from the men in suits. Every instinct in his body told him this was dangerous, dangerous beyond anything he could imagine. But the thought of Paul getting away with everything, the pool, the threats, the money laundering, the murder, was enough to keep him steady. He looked over at Lena. "Let's do it." They parked a few blocks away and walked the rest of the way, staying in the shadows as much as possible. The cold night air bit at James's skin, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were all over the place. He couldn't stop thinking about the ledger, what kind of secrets it contained, what names, what evidence would be waiting for them in that locked office. As they neared the building, Lena led him to the side entrance. She punched in a code on a small keypad beside the door, and after a soft click, the door swung open. James's heart pounded in his chest. He had been in dangerous situations before, bad fights, tight spots, but this felt different. This wasn't about being in the wrong place at the wrong time. This was about exposing an entire criminal operation. Lena motioned for him to follow her as she led the way down a narrow hallway. The building was eerily quiet, and James kept his senses on high alert. They passed several locked doors, but Lena knew where they were going. "This way," Lena whispered, pointing to a small, unmarked door at the end of the hall. She checked the hallway one last time before slipping inside. The office was dark, but the faint light from a desk lamp illuminated the room. James's eyes darted around. The space was clean, almost too clean. There was a large oak desk at the far end of the room, and on it, a filing cabinet that looked far more important than any of the paperwork stacked around it. "That's it," Lena said quietly, pointing to the cabinet. "The ledger should be in there. I'll distract the security cameras. You get the files." James nodded. He didn't have to be told twice. His hands were already reaching for the drawer. Lena pulled out her phone, tapping a few buttons as she worked to disable the security feed. James's fingers trembled as he carefully slid the filing drawer open. The moment it creaked, his breath caught. He couldn't afford to make any noise. Inside, there were stacks of documents, some in neat piles, others scattered without any apparent order. But at the very back of the drawer, beneath a pile of invoices, was a small black book. The ledger. James grabbed it, holding it to his chest like it was the most precious thing in the world. If this was what Lena said it was, it could change everything. The sound of a footstep in the hallway froze him in his tracks. "Did you hear that?" Lena whispered urgently, her face pale in the dim light. James didn't answer. He stood still, heart racing, holding his breath. The footsteps grew louder. Someone was coming down the hallway. Lena quickly grabbed James's arm, pulling him into a small closet beside the desk. She closed the door just in time as the footsteps stopped right outside the office. James held the ledger close, willing his breathing to stay steady. He could hear the sound of a door opening, the office door. Then a voice. "This is the wrong office." James's stomach dropped. It wasn't Paul, but the person who stepped into the room wasn't exactly a stranger either. It was one of the men from the SUVs. James could barely breathe as he watched through the small crack in the closet door. The man walked into the office, his gaze scanning the room before he muttered to himself, "I knew I wasn't imagining things." James's mind raced. What was this guy doing here? Why was he in Paul's office? Was Paul planning something? Or had they been tipped off? Lena motioned for James to stay still. They couldn't risk being caught now, not with everything on the line. The man paced the room for what felt like an eternity, checking the desk, the filing cabinets. His eyes flicked toward the closet, and for a moment, James thought he might open the door. But instead, the man turned and walked back out of the office. Better tell Denton. He's getting impatient. The door clicked shut behind him, and James let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Lena moved first, opening the closet door cautiously. "That was too close," she whispered. "We need to move. Now." James nodded, holding the ledger tightly against his chest. There was no way he was leaving without it. They made their way back through the building, moving faster now. Every sound seemed to echo. Every shadow seemed to hide another threat. But they reached the exit without incident, and just as they stepped outside into the cool night air, Lena turned to him. "We've got it," she said, her voice low but filled with relief. "We've got everything we need." James felt a mix of emotions. Relief, triumph, but also a heavy weight, the realization that this was only the beginning. They had the evidence. They had the ledger. But now, they had to use it before Paul Denton realized what had happened and took matters into his own hands. As they hurried back to the car, James couldn't help but wonder what the next step would bring. The fight wasn't over yet, and he knew that whatever happened next, Paul wasn't going to go down without a fight. But James was ready to bring everything crashing down. James sat in Lena's office, staring at the ledger that was now spread out in front of them on the desk. It looked like an ordinary book at first glance, but the weight of it was anything but ordinary. This small black book held the key to everything: the crimes, the corruption, the manipulation that Paul Denton had hidden from the world for far too long. But as he flipped through the pages, his excitement began to fade into something much darker. The ledger wasn't just a record of fines and payments. It was a detailed account of money laundering, secret deals, and hidden transactions. The names listed on some of the pages were shocking. People from all corners of the city, businesses, government officials. The amount of money involved was enough to make James's head spin. "This is it," Lena said, her voice filled with awe and dread. "This is everything. This is how Paul and his cronies have been getting away with it all." James's fingers hovered over the pages. Each name, each figure in the ledger, was a piece of the puzzle. It wasn't just Paul's criminal empire. It was an entire network. A well-oiled machine of corruption that spanned far beyond just a few bad HOA rules. But the more they uncovered, the more dangerous the situation became. "We need to get this to the authorities," James said, his voice steady but urgent. "This is enough to bring Paul down. We can expose everything." Lena frowned. "It's not that simple. We can't just take this to the police. The corruption runs deep. I've seen this before. They have connections everywhere. If we give them this evidence without proper protection, they'll just make it disappear." James clenched his jaw, frustration bubbling up inside him. "What do we do then? We can't just sit on it." Lena's eyes were sharp, calculating. "I know someone who can help us get this to the right hands. Someone who can guarantee that Paul won't be able to cover this up." James looked at her, skeptical. "Who?" Lena hesitated, her fingers drumming nervously on the desk. "His name's Tom Warren. He works for the FBI. He's been tracking Paul's operation for a while now, but he's been waiting for the right moment to strike. I can get in touch with him, but I need to be sure that the evidence we have is irrefutable. We need to get everything in order before we hand it over." James felt a sudden rush of adrenaline. This was it. This was their chance to bring Paul Denton down once and for all. But at the same time, something about Lena's mention of the FBI made him uneasy. "If we go to the FBI, are we going to be safe?" James asked, his voice low. Lena met his gaze, her expression grim. "That's the risk we're taking, James. We don't have many options left. If we try to go through the police or anyone connected to Paul, we'll be finished before we even start." James rubbed his temples, trying to process everything. He had thought that once they had the evidence, everything would fall into place. But now it seemed like they were caught in a web so tangled and dangerous that no matter what they did, they couldn't be sure of anything. Suddenly, James's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and his stomach dropped. It was a message from an unknown number. "You think you can bring him down? Think again. You're already too late." James's hand tightened around the phone. The message was clear, Paul knew. Before he could say anything, Lena's phone rang. She answered it immediately, her face paling as she listened. I see, she said quietly, nodding as she absorbed the information. Yes, we're on our way. She hung up and turned to James. We need to leave. Now. James didn't question her. He grabbed the ledger and followed Lena out of the office, his mind racing. What had happened? Why was she so urgent? As they hurried to her car, Lena spoke in a low voice, barely above a whisper. Tom Warren just called. Paul's men are already on their way to the office. They know we have the ledger. We don't have time to waste. James's stomach churned. They were being hunted. Where are we going? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Lena's grip on the steering wheel tightened. We'll go to a safe house. Tom set it up just in case this ever happened. We'll wait for him there, and he'll figure out what to do next. The drive felt like an eternity. Every turn, every shadow seemed to hold a threat. James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed, that Paul's men were already closing in. But when they finally arrived at the safe house, an old, nondescript house on the edge of town, it was clear they weren't being followed. For now, they were safe. Lena led him inside, locking the door behind them. The house was dark and quiet, with nothing but the soft hum of the refrigerator breaking the silence. Stay here, Lena said, her voice low. I'll call Tom again and let him know we're here. James nodded and took a seat on the couch, trying to calm his racing mind. The ledger was on the coffee table, just a few feet away, but it felt like a weight pressing down on his chest. He couldn't stop thinking about the message from the unknown number. You're too late. What did that mean? Was it possible that Paul had already taken action? Just as he began to pace, the doorbell rang. James froze, his heart racing again. Who could it be? Lena's eyes widened as she motioned for him to stay quiet. Stay down, she whispered, grabbing a small gun from her bag. James's breath caught in his throat as the doorbell rang a second time, followed by a knock. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The sound of the doorbell echoed through the silent house, a jarring reminder of just how close they were to being discovered. James's breath quickened as he sank lower into the couch, eyes glued to Lena, who had already slipped the small gun in her hand, her expression steely and tense. Stay down, she whispered, her voice tight, barely audible. James nodded, but every instinct in his body screamed for action. The doorbell rang again, followed by a firm knock. Whoever it was, they were persistent. They weren't going to leave. Lena motioned for James to stay still, and with quiet, controlled movements, she eased toward the window, peeking through the blinds. James held his breath as she scanned the street outside. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, Lena stepped back and whispered, It's him. Tom Warren. James exhaled in relief, but the tension didn't leave his body. Tom Warren, the FBI agent who had been tracking Paul's network for months, was their lifeline right now. He was the only person who could ensure their safety and help them bring Paul Denton down. But they weren't safe until Tom had them out of here. Lena hurried to the door, motioning for James to stay back. She opened it just a crack, her voice barely audible as she spoke to Tom. Is it clear? Lena asked, her voice sharp. Tom's deep voice responded from the other side of the door. It's clear for now, but we need to move fast. Paul knows you have the ledger, Lena. We don't have much time. Lena opened the door wide, and Tom stepped inside, his face grim, his eyes scanning the room before locking onto James. Good to see you again, Tom said, though his tone was anything but reassuring. But we don't have time for pleasantries. Paul's men are looking for you. He's already put a bounty on your heads. James's stomach dropped. A bounty? That meant Paul wasn't playing games anymore. He was out for blood, and they were the targets. Lena shot Tom a look. What's the plan, Tom? We have the ledger. We got the evidence. But Paul's got a network that spans way too far. What's our next move? Tom paced for a moment, his hands clasped behind his back. We're going to hit him where it hurts. We don't go to the police yet. If we do, the entire operation gets tipped off. Paul's connected to too many people inside the system. We go to the press. We expose him publicly in front of everyone. Let the world see what he's been hiding. The media can do what the law can't. James frowned. And how are we supposed to pull that off? If Paul's men are looking for us, how do we even get out of here? Tom's gaze flicked to the ledger on the coffee table, then back to James. We move quickly. The media is already sniffing around. But if we want them to take us seriously, we need to get the evidence into the right hands. There's a journalist in town who's been asking questions about Paul Denton and the HOA, Sarah Weston. She's been investigating his business dealings for months now. Lena stepped forward. What's the plan? How do we get to her? Tom paused for a moment, his eyes thoughtful. I've already spoken to her. She's ready to publish the story, but she can't do it alone. We need to get her the ledger, and we need to get it to her now. She has the resources to expose everything. James felt a surge of hope. We can do that. We can get the ledger to her, and everything will come crashing down. Paul won't be able to escape this time. Tom's face was stoic, but his eyes betrayed a sense of urgency. That's the idea, but it's not going to be easy. We're being hunted. Paul's men know where you are, and they won't stop until they get what they want. You've seen what they're capable of. Lena nodded, her eyes hardening. We've seen enough. We can handle it. Tom handed her a small burner phone. This is the number you'll need to contact Sarah. She's waiting at a secure location. He turned to James. We're going to move out, and I'll make sure you're not followed. But we need to be careful. Paul Denton is more dangerous than you think. James clenched his fists. This was it. They were going to do it. They were going to take Paul Denton down once and for all. But as Tom led them out of the house, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking straight into a trap. They took back alleys and side streets, moving quickly but quietly. Every step felt like it could be their last. The tension in the air was palpable. Lena was ahead, phone in hand, texting Sarah Weston about their plan. Tom flanked them, constantly scanning the surroundings for any signs of danger. As they reached the designated meeting point, an old diner on the outskirts of town, Tom stopped. Stay here, he said, his voice low. I'll check things out. Wait for my signal. Lena and James exchanged a look. They both knew the risks, but they also knew they had no choice. If they wanted to bring Paul down, they had to take this final step. Minutes passed like hours. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the pavement. James could feel the weight of the ledger in his hands, and the silence around him seemed to amplify the pounding of his heart. Finally, Tom returned, motioning for them to follow. It's clear. Let's move. They walked through the diner's back entrance, entering a small, dimly lit room where Sarah Weston was waiting. She was sitting at a table, laptop open in front of her. Her eyes were sharp, her expression focused. When she saw them, she stood up, her hand extended. You must be Lena and James, she said, her voice calm, but with an edge of urgency. I've heard a lot about you, and I've been waiting for this moment. Lena handed her the ledger without hesitation. This is everything. Expose him. Take him down. Sarah nodded, her fingers already flying across the keyboard. I'm starting the article now. Once it's out, the whole world will know what Paul Denton has been hiding. He won't be able to run anymore. But as Sarah continued typing, the sudden sound of tires screeching outside caused all three of them to freeze. James's heart skipped a beat. He knew what this meant. Paul's men were here, and this time, they weren't going to let them get away. The screeching of tires grew louder, and the unmistakable sound of a car slamming in a park echoed outside the diner. James's pulse spiked. Paul's men were here. The time for running, for hiding, was over. Sarah slammed her laptop shut, her eyes wide with panic. They know we're here. We need to move now. Lena immediately turned toward the back door, her hand on her gun. Stay close, both of you, she said, her voice firm. If they found us, we're not leaving here without a fight. Tom was already by the door, peeking through a small crack in the window. There are at least 4 of them outside, he said, his voice low. And they're armed. This isn't going to be easy. James's heart was racing, but a new sense of clarity washed over him. They were so close to bringing Paul Denton down. They couldn't let fear stop them now. Tom pulled out a small black device from his jacket. I've got a signal jammer. It'll block their communications for a while, but we have to move fast. If we don't, they'll be on us in minutes. Lena nodded. Sarah, can you make sure that article gets published? We can't let this information get buried. Sarah's fingers flew across her laptop again. Already sending. It'll go live in a few seconds. The seconds dragged on. James could barely breathe, each second more intense than the last. Then, with a sudden ping, Sarah looked up, her face breaking into a relieved smile. It's done. The article is out. James didn't have time to process it. He could already hear the sound of footsteps and the low murmur of voices outside. They were running out of time. Tom hit a button on the jammer, and the buzzing sound that had filled the air stopped. They can't call for backup now. We need to move now. Without another word, they burst through the back door and into the alley behind the diner. The cold night air hit James's face like a slap, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he took a deep breath. They had the evidence. They had exposed Paul Denton, but their fight wasn't over yet. As they turned the corner of the diner, the unmistakable sound of gunshots rang out behind them. James's heart dropped. They weren't getting away that easily. Lena immediately pushed them forward, her voice commanding, "Keep moving." They ran, their footsteps echoing through the empty streets. James's legs burned, his lungs screamed for air, but he couldn't stop. Not now. They reached the next block, but as they rounded the corner, James froze. A black SUV screeched to a halt in front of them, blocking the street. The doors flew open, and two armed men stepped out, their guns raised. "Get down," Tom yelled, pushing Lena and Sarah to the ground as he pulled out his own weapon. James dropped to the pavement, his heart hammering in his chest. This was it, the moment they'd been fighting for. The men didn't hesitate. They started firing. Tom returned fire with expert precision, taking out one of the gunmen in an instant. But the other man was quicker, aiming straight at Tom. "No!" Lena shouted, reaching for her own gun. But before she could react, there was a loud crash as the second gunman was hit from the side. The figure who had taken the shot was already retreating into the shadows before James could even process what had happened. Tom looked up, panting but unscathed. "It's over. They're gone." James stared in disbelief. Who had just saved them? Lena stood up, her face pale, but her eyes filled with something stronger. "We're not done yet," she said. "We still have to make sure Paul can't touch us." They didn't wait. They didn't hesitate. They kept running, heading toward the final safe house, a place where they could finally lay low until the world knew the truth about Paul Denton. When they arrived at the house, they didn't talk. They didn't need to. They just sat in silence as Sarah, Lena, and Tom kept watch, while James stared at the news feed on his phone. The headline blared. Maplewood Estates, HOA, president exposed in massive criminal scheme. Paul Denton arrested. The world had learned the truth. James's chest tightened with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Paul Denton, the man who had tried to destroy his life, was going to prison. All of it, the lies, the corruption, the threats, had come crashing down. The sound of sirens grew distant, the flashing lights fading in the background. They had done it. They had taken down a criminal empire. But as the night stretched on and the adrenaline finally wore off, James couldn't shake the feeling that the world they had exposed was just the tip of the iceberg. Paul Denton might be locked up, but his influence was still out there. His connections, his network, it wasn't over. James closed his eyes, his mind already racing toward the future. There was still so much left to uncover. But for the first time, he didn't feel completely alone in the fight. And maybe, just maybe, they could make the world a little bit safer.